Our next session draws upon the expertise of the nonprofit John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which seeks to foster informed and engaged communities in order to better strengthen our democracy. Here today with a report from the Knight Foundation that will help us take the pulse of the public is Sam Gill, Vice President, Communities and Impact, and a Senior Advisor to the President of the Knight Foundation.
I want to just echo the repeated thanks to Duquesne and the Pittsburgh Foundation for putting on this tremendous event, and the Knight Foundation is very proud not only to be able to talk to you today about some of the work we've commissioned, but also to be a supporter of this event. The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation is committed to supporting democracy through more informed and engaged communities, and our origins in the Knight newspaper chain have meant that one of our abiding commitments has been to free expression and the First Amendment. And one of the ways that we try to honor this commitment, in addition to supporting conferences like this and many of the initiatives represented today, is in commissioning research on young people in particular, because we really believe that young people are the harbingers of what is to come for free expression. And I think actually there's maybe no better indicator of that than what we're not talking about today. I was thinking during the great performance yesterday by the Slants that if we had had this conference 30 years ago, at least one of the panels, if not much of one of the days, would have been about song lyrics, the commercial success of song lyrics. And that debate was really out of step with the views of young people in the 80s and 90s, and those young people grew up and created the internet instead of regulating song lyrics. So what I'm going to do today is run very quickly through some polling. It'll be kind of an eye test, so enjoy the color and light show. I'll tell you what's on the slides. All of it's publicly available, but there's really three ideas that I wanna leave you with today. The first is that in looking at how young people think about free expression, the strains of managing an increasingly pluralistic society and much more pluralistic access to power are really evident, and the attempt to balance liberal norms to promote an inclusive society are really quite evident. The second thing I want to leave you with is really kind of a question, which is, are universities important because they're at the front lines of our understanding of free expression, or are they important because they're the crucible of a debate that has not so much to do with universities about who gets to say what about power and identity in this country? And I'm not forwarding either view of that, but I think that that's a question we should be asking in looking at this polling. Are we projecting onto universities a larger debate about expression versus identity? And the sort of third thing I want to leave you with is that young people, the challenges that young people face in their online experience, not just what's happening online, but their experience of what's happening online, are also really evident in this polling. So what I'm going to talk to you about are some findings, first from the second poll we've done of 3,000 college students. The polling was done in 2017 and released this year. I'll be sharing with you some yet to be released results from some polling that we've done of high school students. Every 2 years since about 2004, Knight Foundation has surveyed nearly 10,000 high school students as well as 1,000 teachers. And then I will also share a few findings just to kind of baseline this data from adults. This is polling we've not commissioned, but it's through the Freedom Forum Institute of the museum. So first, we've asked college students 2 years in a row about the security of each of the 5 freedoms. And between 2016 and 2017, the feeling of the security of each of the 5 freedoms, speech, religion, press, peaceful assembly, and the freedom to petition government, have declined. Some of this is probably due to college students, particularly in residential universities, being somewhat more progressive, but we have seen declines. These views differ significantly by gender in a few cases. So on the far left is overall, is sort of men versus women on speech, and then it goes through each of the 5 freedoms to the right. And you'll notice on the right side that there are really pronounced splits, in particular around freedom of assembly and freedom to petition government. Women are sort of much more likely than men on college campuses to say that the rights of assembly and petitioning government are secure. And this pattern is repeated on the next slide when you look at this by race. So the blue column is white students, the green column is black students, and the purple column are HBCU students. And again, if you look on the far right side, students of color are really far less likely to say that rights of assembly and the right to petition government are secure. And so this really speaks to sort of the first point that I made about pluralism, which is that there is a pattern here around women, people of color, those who maybe, first of all, haven't been as represented on campuses in the past, really speaking to the action rights within the First Amendment, the rights that are about access to the forum, participating within the forum, exercising power as a result of belief. These are some high school results that have yet to be released. And on the left side, you'll see that overall views about the First Amendment are relatively consistent. So the percentage of high school students that say the First Amendment goes, quote, too far in the rights that it guarantees has largely been stable. It was a little high in the mid-2000s, probably as a result of national security discussions that were going on then. You'll hear more in the next panel, I'm sure. And then on the right, though, this is broken out by race. And again, you see black high school students on the left, 40%, are far more likely to say that the First Amendment goes too far in the rights it guarantees. And then this, just briefly, this is adults over the years. And again, it's largely stable, the adult views about the First Amendment going too far. So one of the sort of flashpoints of the debate is, and we heard some of the discussion in the last panel, is whether students today want an open and adventurous environment. And in 2016 and 2017, we found that overall there's very strong support for the idea that campus environment should be open rather than restricting and restraining certain kinds of speech. This declined a little bit between 2016 and 2017, but overall, when college students are asked this question, they do favor an open environment. The question is really just sort of what does an open environment mean and who has access to that environment? So in our most recent survey, we've really tried to push students a little bit. So one of the questions we've asked is just for them to assess the importance to our democracy of both the value of protecting free speech rights and the value of promoting an inclusive society that is welcoming of diverse groups. And overall, they think both are really essential. So, almost incredibly strong majorities. It's almost unanimous that this is an important part of our democracy. But then the other thing that we've done is we forced them to make a choice. What's more important to our democracy? And so on the left, you'll see that actually college students, by a ratio of by a proportion of 53% to 46%, actually will choose the value of a diverse and inclusive society over free speech when they're forced to choose. And we can debate about whether that's a false choice, but we wanted to get at the level of priority. And there are really interesting differences by gender and by race. So men are much more likely to say protecting free speech rights. Women are, it's almost inverted. And then it's not quite an inversion, but whites narrowly favor protecting free speech rights, whereas there's a huge split for black students, for Democratic students, and then Republicans are the inverse of Democrats. So again, you see this pattern, women, people of color, really wondering whether they have the same access to the sort of the open spirit of debate that's happening on campus and the power that's represented by that. On the political results, I think you really here see a reflection of a debate that we're having outside of college campuses, of the kind of debate that's often epitomized as one about political correctness versus identity, for example. Sometimes political correctness versus feelings is really reflected in these results. I think the other thing that's reflected in these results is the question of whether conservative students do actually feel at home and authorized to speak their minds on campus. And I think different campuses have different experience of this, but I won't show all the results, but this is something that also comes through. So what really matters to college students when we've asked this questions a couple years in a row is the content of speech. So the college students are most likely to favor restrictions when it comes to slurs or intentionally offensive language. The wearing of costumes, which was a flashpoint a few years ago, is also up there. But for political viewpoints, the support for restrictions really dropped. So again, students at least viscerally say, we ought to have an open political debate. You ought to be able to say whatever you want about political affairs. And again, I think this is a really different sensibility about identity. And a question we may be confronting here or that college students are wrestling with is, do they think that slurs are like shouting fire at a theater? Slurs are like words intended to incite violence in the way that they hurt people. And I thought there was a great discussion between the presidents that President Zimmer raised about, how do you account for feelings? And in some cases, it's really clear. And in other cases, that line between a feeling and a line between trauma, which I thought was brought to life in that example, or other kinds of marginalization is just harder to deal with. And so if we decide to evolve First Amendment doctrine to account for this, some of the bright lines that we rely on may become much more difficult to police. I won't spend much time on this slide, but high school students tend to have the same view. So 90% say that you can express unpopular opinions. Only 29% say that you should be able to express threatening speech, and offensive speech, quote unquote, is right in the middle. So much more ambivalence again around a content that can offend. College students do really acknowledge that there's a deterrent effect to speech. So a majority of college students agree, and this actually increased from 2016 to 2017, that their campus climate prevents students from saying things that they believe because they think other people might find them offensive. So they're not totally blind to the consequences of trying to figure out the balance and sometimes tension between inclusion and free speech. And they really do favor restrictions that create more spaces for discussion. So that we asked about safe spaces or areas of campus, enormous support for these at least to be available. Free speech zones had very significant support to be available. Speech codes, much more ambivalent. So a narrow majority opposes instituting speech codes, but a significant minority does think that we ought to have speech codes on campuses. When it comes to more disruptive forms of protest, college students are actually less favorable than a lot of the news debate about this would have you believe. So for handing out literature, protesting speakers, sit-ins, and shouting down speakers, most students think this is at best sometimes acceptable, and particularly on shouting down speakers, 62% say this is never acceptable, and then 90% say it's never acceptable for violence to stop speakers. It is important to note that 10% saying that violence is okay is a worrying minority, as small as it is. But again, this sort of gets to my second point, which is there is a question here about whether the political debate that we're having about what's happening on college campuses really reflects the reality, both of what's happening and of what college students actually think about what ought to happen when it comes to free expression. So I want to close with just a few data points about online and the experience of speech online. So in our most recent survey of college students this year, we asked them for the first time, where are you actually having political debate? It struck us that so many of the discussions that we're having, you're imagining students in a classroom or students out on the quad talking to each other. But is that really where it's happening? And 57% of students said that most of their discussions about political and social ideas are happening online. And I think this is a really critical reality for us to confront. Yesterday's panels, I thought, did a tremendous job of bringing this out. The online world, for most people, particularly young people, is not a place you go to. It is a part of your life. It is part of the fundamental layer of your life and your negotiation around ideas and around values and around public affairs. And so how we adjudicate these decisions not only has to take the online world into account, it's sort of inextricably bound up with our ideas of what expression is. And I'm sure Richard Gingras from Google will talk a lot about this in the afternoon. The other thing we found really consistently is that college students are incredibly ambivalent about social media and its impact. So we asked people a few things. One, is it too easy for people to say things anonymously on social media? Not only does a strong majority think it is, that's gone up from 2016 to 2017 to 83%. When we asked students, does social media stifle free expression because too many people just block views they disagree with? That was not a majority view in 2016. In 2017, 60% of students said they agreed with that. We asked people, does social media stifle free expression because people are afraid of being attacked or shamed? 49% said that in 2016. In 2017, that was up to 59%. And then we just said, agree or disagree. The dialogue that occurs on social media is usually civil. 41% agreed in 2016. That was down to 37% in 2017. So I think this also belies sort of another piece of conventional wisdom that we traffic in, which is our problem is young people recklessly using these social media tools. And I think the reality is totally the contrary. There is no question that young people are by far more significant adopters of these tools. There's clearly no turning back when it comes to social media as a layer of our discourse, but they're incredibly ambivalent about what the aggregated effects of these tools are. They're not happy with the impact that social media tools might be having on discourse and the ability to speak freely and openly. And so this isn't a question of the grown-ups figuring out how to solve a problem that faces young people. It's the fact that the grown-ups have helped to create a world in which young people are excited about their ability to express, but incredibly concerned about how they're going to do so and contribute to the marketplace of ideas. High school students evince a very similar level of ambivalence. So on the left chart, in general, high school students, which are the blue column, largely agree with college students about some of the challenges of social media. And on the right, you'll actually see that 75% of female students say it's too easy for people to say things anonymously online. So again, depending on who you are, you might have an even more significant level of ambivalence. This slide is a little out of place here, but I'll get to it in a moment, why it ties in a moment. We did ask college students as well for the first time about whether they actually think any hate speech should be protected, and 64% said that no hate speech should. So again, this question of managing pluralism comes up, and it has a relationship to their views on the internet. So when we asked college students about their concerns on hate speech online, 82% agreed with the idea that the internet is responsible for an increase in hate speech, and 68% said so students actually agree that social media companies should be responsible for limiting hate speech on their platforms. And then we also asked this question of high school students, and in general, most high school students agree that governments should actually require social media sites to monitor and remove objectionable content from online. So, obviously these questions lose a lot of the nuance that university administrators have to figure out, that faculty have to figure out, that students themselves need to navigate, and that we as a society are going to have to manage. But I think there's no question that some really fundamental shifts may be underway in the way that an emerging generation would like to see the contours of free expression. And I think what our polling shows is that those views, whether we agree with them or not, and whether we agree that the consequences of those changes would be good or bad for the kind of free expression we need in our democracy, I think there's really sort of no question that it's at least manifesting from the experience of college students. And so all I would say is the more that we can begin to understand that experience and identify the ways in which it really is saying something accurate about the conditions of our informed society versus not, is only going to make it easier for us to make a lot of the really critical decisions, not only within institutions that protect and uphold the values of free expression, but also legally as we begin to redefine the contours of these rights in an increasingly digital age. So with that, I'll cede the stage. Thank you all very much for this opportunity.